The Bible is seen by Christians as the Word of God, a book meant to guide faith and life. But while many passages are taken very seriously, there are also sections that most Christians either set aside, reinterpret, or simply don't follow in daily life. And today we're taking a closer look at 10 parts of the Bible that are often ignored by Christians and why. Number 1. Animal sacrifice rituals. If you've ever flipped through the book of Leviticus, you'll notice it spends a lot of time describing sacrifices, burnt offerings, grain offerings, sin offerings. It even goes into exact details on how and when these sacrifices should be made, as described in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. Back then, animal sacrifices were central to worship. They were seen as a way to cover sins and stay in right relationship with God. But most Christians today don't bring sheep or bulls to church, and there's a reason for that. Christians believe that Jesus' death on the cross replaced the old sacrificial system, as described in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 18. In other words, the sacrifices in the Old Testament were just a shadow pointing to something greater. They had to be repeated over and over, but they could never completely take away sin. When Jesus offered himself once and for all, Christians believe he fulfilled what those sacrifices were always pointing toward. That's why animal sacrifice rituals are largely ignored today. Number 2. Kosher dietary laws. The Old Testament also lays out a long list of dietary rules. In Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14, God tells the Israelites which foods are clean and which are unclean. Pork, shellfish, and certain other animals were strictly off limits. These food laws served an important purpose. They set Israel apart from other nations and reminded them daily that they were called to be holy. But if you look around today, most Christians eat bacon without a second thought. So why is that? Many point to the New Testament. In Acts 10, Peter has a vision where God tells him, "What God has made clean, do not call common." Some argue this vision was about people, not food, but early Christians understood it as lifting dietary restrictions, so Gentiles, non-Jews, could join the faith without changing their diets. Paul also wrote about this in Romans 14 and Colossians 2, teaching that Christians shouldn't be judged by what they eat or drink. Simply put, Christians believe that Jesus fulfilled the ceremonial laws, including the dietary ones. That's why most churches don't require keeping kosher, even though those commands are clearly written in the Bible. Number 3. Sabbath on the seventh day, Saturday. The 10 Commandments clearly say, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God," as written in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. That seventh day is Saturday, but most Christians today gather for worship on Sunday instead. The reason usually given is that Sunday is the day Jesus rose from the dead, and early Christians started meeting then to celebrate his resurrection. Over time, this became the standard practice in most denominations. Still, this shift is a big departure from the original command. The Bible never actually says Sunday is the new Sabbath. Some groups, like the Seventh-day Adventists, stick with Saturday worship, arguing that the original command was never changed. Others, like Catholics and many Protestants, teach that the Sabbath command is still valid in principle, but the specific day was adapted to mark the resurrection. Number 4. Festival observances. In the Old Testament, God gave Israel a calendar of festivals in Leviticus 23. These were sacred gatherings commanded by God himself. They included Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, and several others. Each of these had a symbolic purpose, pointing ahead to God's plan of redemption. For example, Passover reminded Israel of their deliverance from Egypt, but Christians later saw it as pointing toward Jesus as the true Passover lamb. Today, though, most Christians don't celebrate these biblical feasts. Instead, they observe holidays like Christmas and Easter. The interesting thing is that the Bible never commands believers to celebrate Christmas or Easter, yet these have become the central Christian celebrations. Why is that? The New Testament provides the main reason. Paul tells believers in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, not to let anyone judge them about keeping festivals, because those Old Testament feasts were a shadow of what was to come, and the reality is found in Christ. In other words, Christians believe Jesus fulfilled the meaning of the Old Covenant festivals, so they don't feel bound to celebrate them literally. That said, Christianity didn't leave worship without holy days. Over time, the church created its own liturgical calendar with holidays like Christmas, Easter, the Feast of the Ascension, All Saints' Day, and more. Number 5. Mixed fabrics and agricultural laws. If you've ever come across some of the stranger-sounding Old Testament laws, you might have noticed rules about clothing and farming. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 19, and Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 9 through 11, forbid wearing clothes made from 2 different fabrics, like wool and linen woven together. They also forbid planting 2 different types of seeds in the same field, or even plowing with an ox and a donkey together. These regulations seem far removed from modern life, and most Christians ignore them completely. But why were they there in the first place? These laws were part of what's called kilayim, or mixture prohibitions, and they were meant to set Israel apart as a holy people. God wanted visible distinctions in how they lived, farmed, and even dressed, to remind them daily of their unique calling. Some Christians today interpret these laws symbolically, saying that the command not to mix fabrics points to a deeper truth about purity and holiness, that believers should remain spiritually unmixed with the world. Others take the fulfillment view and say that in Christ, these ceremonial distinctions no longer apply at all. In practice, you'll hardly find any church today teaching that wearing polyester cotton blends is sinful. These commands are widely seen as specific to Israel under the Old Covenant. Number 6. Tithing rules. The idea of tithing is familiar to many churchgoers, but its biblical background often surprises people. The word tithe simply means 1/10. In the Old Testament, tithing meant giving a tenth of your crops, livestock, or other produce. Deuteronomy chapter 14 verses 22 through 29 describes one particular tithe, where the Israelites were supposed to bring a tenth of their produce to God's sanctuary, not just to hand it over, but to eat and enjoy it there, in God's presence with their families. They were even allowed to turn it into money and spend it on whatever they wanted, whether oxen, wine, or strong drink, as long as they celebrated it before God. That tithe also included caring for the Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows. And today you'll notice that this practice looks very different in most churches. Modern tithing usually refers to giving 10% of your income to the church. The money is used for ministry, the upkeep of pastors, church buildings, and community work. While caring for the needy is still emphasized, many churches focus heavily on the financial obligation to support their leaders and programs. Number 7. Divorce restrictions. One of the most challenging and debated topics in both the Old and New Testaments is divorce. Deuteronomy chapter 24 verses 1 through 4 gave Israel a set of rules about it, but they were still restrictive. A man could divorce his wife, but if she remarried and that second marriage ended, she could never go back to her first husband. In the New Testament, Jesus made the teaching even stricter. In Matthew chapter 19 verse 9, Jesus allowed divorce only in cases of sexual immorality. In Mark and Luke, his words are even more absolute, saying that remarriage after divorce amounts to adultery. For centuries, church leaders treated divorce as something extremely serious, often condemning remarriage altogether. But when you look at Christianity today, you see a wide range of approaches. The Catholic Church, for example, doesn't recognize divorce at all, though it does grant annulments if it determines that a marriage was never valid in the first place. The Eastern Orthodox Church allows divorce and remarriage under certain circumstances, but still treats it as a last resort. Many Protestant denominations discourage divorce, but allow it in situations like abuse, adultery, or abandonment, often permitting remarriage as well. What stands out is that while the Bible itself is very strict on the issue, modern Christianity has softened the rules. Some groups stick closely to Jesus' original words, while others adapt them to meet the realities of modern life. Number 8. Head coverings for women. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul talks about women covering their heads while praying or prophesying. He connects it to the idea of God's order, Christ as the head of man and man as the head of woman. In the culture of Corinth at the time, a woman covering her head showed modesty, respect, and submission. Paul even says that if a woman prays without a covering, she dishonors her head, comparing it to having her hair cut off. For centuries, head coverings were normal in Christian worship. Women in the early church and throughout most of history wore veils or coverings when they prayed. It wasn't until the mid-20th century, especially in the West, that the practice started to disappear. Social changes and the rise of feminism in the 1960s played a big role in that shift. Today, only a few Christian groups take this teaching literally. Conservative Anabaptists like the Mennonites, Amish, and Hutterites still require women to cover their heads, often all the time, not just in church. Some Eastern Orthodox traditions also keep the practice. But most modern churches view the passage as cultural, something specific to Paul's time that doesn't apply the same way today. That's why in many places you won't see women covering their heads at all, even though Paul's instructions are still in the Bible. Number 9. Greeting with a holy kiss. Several times in the New Testament, Paul tells believers to greet one another with a holy kiss. You'll find it in Romans chapter 16 verse 16, 1 Corinthians chapter 16 verse 20, 2 Corinthians chapter 13 verse 12, and in a couple of other places. In the early church, this was a regular part of worship. The kiss of peace was exchanged before communion and was seen as a way of showing unity and love among believers. Early Christians even set rules around it. Men would greet men and women would greet women, and it was always meant to be a pure, respectful sign of fellowship. Over time, though, the literal kiss faded in many places. It was replaced with different cultural equivalents, like handshakes, hugs, or spoken blessing of peace. Some groups like the Amish and certain conservative Mennonite churches still practice the holy kiss today, but in most modern churches, it's been replaced by something more culturally comfortable. Number 10. Selling possessions and holding all things in common. The book of Acts describes the very first Christian community in Jerusalem as radically generous. Acts chapter 2, verses 44 and 45 says that believers sold their possessions and shared everything they had. Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 35 goes even further, saying that no one claimed private ownership of property and that they distributed resources so everyone's needs were met. That picture of communal living sounds a lot like what people today would call Christian communism. Some groups have tried to live this way, like the Hutterites, Shakers, and Bruderhof communities, who practice common ownership to this day. They take these passages as a model for how Christians should live, but most Christians today don't see these passages as commands for everyone. Instead, they view them as a description of how the early church lived under unique circumstances. For example, some scholars think the first believers expected Jesus to return very soon, so they didn't see the point of holding on to wealth. Others point to Acts 5, where Peter tells Ananias that selling his land was voluntary, not required. Later letters from Paul encourage generosity and caring for the poor, but they don't tell believers to give up all private property. Because of this, the majority of Christians interpret Acts 2 and 4 as an inspiring example of generosity, not a permanent rule. Now, if you like this video and learned something new, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. More content like this is on the way.